As you know, Dream of the Red Chamber is pretty difficult to read. People ask me all the time for tips on how to read the book, so let me give you a few tips. Now, you've got to realize that Dream of the Red Chamber is not actually a singular text. What I mean by that is that there are actually three distinct linguistic registers in the book. That's one of the things that makes the book so difficult. So let's go through these one by one, and we're going to start with the hardest. Okay, first you've got the poetic register. Now, Dream of the Red Chamber is filled with poems. This isn't unusual, actually. Books like Romance of the Three Kingdoms also have a lot of poems. The same is true of Journey to the West. But unlike those books, in Dream of the Red Chamber, you can't skip the poems. I mean, sure, you could summarize the story if you wanted to, but the poems are actually the heart of the artistic creation. If you skipped over the poems, you'd be taking everything interesting out of the book, and you'd be left then with a story that is kind of ho-hum. Well, as you might know, Arthur Waley once translated Journey of the West into English. That's this book, Monkey, A Folktale of China. However, Waley decided not to translate any of the many poems in that book. The great sinologist Anthony C. Yu took him to task for this in the introduction to his own translation of that book. And Journey to the West, of course, is a lot different than Dream of the Red Chamber. So in Journey to the West, if you take out the poems, you still have like a lot of stuff going on. The characters are always traveling out on their adventure. In Dream of the Red Chamber, however, nobody goes anywhere, and the poetry club, of course, will make no sense to you if there are no poems. From the very beginning of the book, Dream of the Red Chamber's poems are extremely important, and some of them are really difficult to understand. So take this famous two-line poem on the sides of the archway leading to the illusory realm of the Great Void as an example. It reads, 假作真实真亦假, 无谓有处有还无. My translation of this is, when falsehood is taken as truth, the truth becomes false. Where nothing is claimed to be something, that something becomes nothing. Anyway, you get bonus points if any of that made any sense to you. In fact, there are a lot of poems with deeper meaning than they have at first. So the most difficult thing about understanding Dream of the Red Chamber is figuring out poems like this. Okay, to understand this, you need to understand what the word huan means. So we see this in the Chinese name of that illusory realm of the Great Void, which is Taishu Huanjing. Huan means an illusion, something that people think is real but actually is not real. So when we look back at that poem, we can understand what that falsehood taken as truth line refers to. That's the illusion. Similarly, if nothing is claimed to be something, it's actually still nothing. And then you've got the intertextual references as well, which are almost impossible to translate. This Jia character is a direct reference to the Jia family name. Think of characters like Jia Baoyu. Zhen, meanwhile, is a direct reference to the Zhen family name, so you think of characters like Zhen Shiyin. Many scholars believe that the author originally intended to create a contrast between the Jia and Zhen families. In fact, there is a character named Zhen Baoyu who's very similar to Jia Baoyu, though he only makes a very brief appearance. And so there's a good chance that this poem is a possible reference to a story arc that just didn't fit in. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff like this in the book. To understand some of these poems, you really need to understand the book first. And so now you know why so many scholars will spend so much time reading the same book. I'll give you another quick example. Among all the poems and songs in Chapter 5, this one, called the Zhongshen Wu, or Regret at the End of Life, really stands out. Now, the first line won't make much sense to you if you don't already know the story. It reads, 斗道是进入良缘 安之念目视前盟. In English, this would be, everyone insists that gold and jade were fated together, yet I can only think of the old pact between the tree and the stone. So you've got gold, jade, wood, stone. It's like watching an old episode of Captain Planet, right? Well, this isn't some sort of metaphysical reference to traditional Taoist alchemy or something like that. No, this is a reference to other things within Dream of the Red Chamber itself. Or basically, this is a metatextual poem. The pact between the tree and the stone, or the Mu Shi Qian Meng, refers to a confusing story at the beginning of Chapter 1. So, Jia Baoyu was originally a magical stone left over from the goddess Nuwa, who used a bunch of stones to patch up the heavens. He was given life and could think, though he sadly realized that he was unwanted and had been discarded. The tree is actually a reference to a magical plant, also in the first chapter, though it doesn't show up until a little bit later. The plant was the premortal Lin Daiyu, and she gained the gift of life when magical dew dripped off the back of the stone onto the plant. Lin Daiyu vowed to repay the stone for this kind deed with her tears. That was the only equivalent to the magical dew that she could think of. And that's why Lin Daiyu is always crying. The pact between the tree and the stone is a direct reference to this, though you really have to read deeply into the story to understand it, and there are a ton of references just like that one. And so that means that the gold and jade need to refer to somebody else, right? So the jade is almost certainly Jia Baoyu. Remember that the yu in his name means jade. You can see here in the poem that it's exactly the same character. Now Jin, which is right next to it, refers to Shui Bao Chai. In particular, look at the character Chai in her name, which means a woman's hairpin. Jin, or gold, is the radical. It's not obvious, I know, but that's the way that it works. And there are a lot of meta-poetic references in this book. Or, in other words, the best way to learn how to read the poetry in Dream of the Red Chamber is to read the book. Now, I know that sounds bizarre, but it's kind of what you have to do, even if it means reading the book over and over again. Anyway, next we're going to get to the classical Chinese register, which is also indeed a thing in this book. Although this book is known for its colloquial language, you do need some familiarity with classical Chinese to make any sense of it. Now, as I've mentioned before, Chapter 2 of Dream of the Red Chamber is really boring. Most of it consists of a long and abstract speech given by Jia Yucun, who really isn't much of a speaker or an intellectual. However, if you want to understand what Jia Yucun is talking about, you really need to have at least some familiarity with classical Chinese metaphysics. And he lists person after person in a way that only makes sense if you actually know who these people are. In other words, Dream of the Red Chamber is not the sort of book that you can just sit down and read. If you want to figure out what's going on, you have to take the time to look things up. So, for example, Jia Yucun lists Cui Yingying among the great eccentrics of China's past, comparing her to Jia Baoyu. Unlike almost everybody else on his list, Cui Yingying is actually a fictional character. She comes from an old play called Romance of the Western Chamber, which just so happens to have been a major influence on Dream of the Red Chamber. In fact, Jia Baoyu quotes Romance of the Western Chamber more than once. Cui Yingying happens to be the female love interest in Romance of the Western Chamber, the heroine of the play. And in the earlier work called Yingying Zhuan, or Yingying's biography, Cui Yingying winds up rejecting her would-be suitor. She chooses instead to live a life of misery, which itself is a precursor of things to come in Dream of the Red Chamber. In this sense, it's a book that really tests your understanding of Chinese literature. But then there's also the colloquial register. This is the part that's probably the hardest for foreigners like you and me to get a hold of. Lin Daiyu is a well-educated character and actually speaks that way in this book. Take this part from the middle of Chapter 3 as an example. So here, Lin Daiyu is trying to convince grandmother Jia that she won't have anything to do with Jia Baoyu, that she's heard about him from her late mother, and that she'll make sure that she doesn't cross paths with him. So here she says, 况我来了，自然和姐妹们一处，弟兄们是邻远邻房，岂有沾惹之理? The English translation of this is, of course, since I've come here, I will naturally just stick with my female cousins. The boys are in separate courtyards, how could there be any chance for interacting? But what you can only see in the Chinese is the semi-classical grammatical pattern and phrasing at the end. Qi, for example, comes from classical Chinese and introduces a rhetorical question, such as how or how can it be that? It's the equivalent of 怎么会 in modern Chinese. 沾惹之理, meanwhile, is one of those fun four-character phrases that has defined the Chinese language since its very beginning. It literally means there would be no sense in getting involved in a way that would invite trouble. In other words, Lin Daiyu has speech that is refined and is quite careful. It's very cultivated. She speaks with a lot of traditional Southern Chinese charm, and she's a major contrast to the very coarse and very northern speech of Granny Liu, who is my personal favorite character. We first meet Granny Liu in Chapter 6, and it's really memorable if you read it in Chinese. Now, in this section of the book, she's trying to come up with a plan to help her family get some money, ideally by sneaking some away from the rich Jia family. So in this part, she says, 哎呦，可是说了，侯门四海，我是个什么东西？他家人又不认得我，去了也是白跑。 So I translate this as that's exactly the problem, just as they say, the gates of the noble are as deep as the sea. And what kind of person am I to go there anyway? They don't know me. If I go, it will be a waste. Just so you know, Homen Sihai is an idiom that means that the mansions of the rich people are inaccessible to the common people, people like her. But the rest of her language here is extremely common, and honestly, it sounds like modern Northern Chinese. Aiyo, of course, is a phrase that you know well if you've been studying Chinese already. 我是什么东西 is almost a vulgar way to refer to yourself, very self-depreciating. And it doesn't take long for you to hear verbs like bai pao to go over there in vain. Granny Liu's speech alone means that you really need to know colloquial Chinese to understand the book. She speaks just like somebody from Northeast China, and not just in the 18th century. I'm talking about today. It's uncanny, actually, and it really adds a lot of character and flavor to the book. And of course, it's almost impossible to translate. Anyway, that gives you an idea of the enormity of the task. You have to understand the book itself to even begin to understand its poetry, which is pretty intimidating and also really addicting. You need a deep grasp of classical Chinese due to all the textual references. And at the same time, you need to understand what people on the street speak like, especially people from northern China. Anyway, Dream of the Red Chamber is an incredible piece of literature. And honestly, if you want to, you could look at this book as a clash between the more traditional and civilized literary style of South China and the more crude and guttural cultural tradition of North China. And as refined as that southern style might be, the northern style always seems to win out in the end.